Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by Speedway Properties. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. Jim has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company, publisher of regional books as well as the Coinery. Jim has written over 1,500 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. He serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission, and he's also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is the 40th in a series of talks that's titled Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln, and this one's about the Lincoln's early airfield. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
Since we've not done this program before, we're not sure how long it's going to take. If it does run over, we have a couple of options, and we may forego questions. We may continuing it the next go around. Specifically, this one is just called Landing in Lincoln, and it's about aviation in Lincoln. So I'll be as surprised as you what turns up. I've never having heard it before. Beforehand, we're talking to a couple of you about what the heck has this picture got to do with aviation in Lincoln, and a couple of caveats before we even start. I'm not going to cover the Lincoln Air Force Base. I'm not going to cover the U.S. Army Airfield, in other words. And there's a terrible amount of confusion with airfields in Lincoln, as we'll see as we go through this. And I've tried to separate the blizzard of names that two of the airfields have. They overlap each other. We'll see that we talk about the South Airfield. We don't know for sure which airfield we're talking about. And it's true that the newspaper, history books, they all just sort of commingle some of these names. So if you're confused, why, and at the end, if we have time for question and answers, maybe you can help me answer it. But so far, newspapers.com, for example, has been totally confused, as everybody else. So what does this picture have to do with aviation in Lincoln? Well, we're talking about airfields particularly, and this is a picture of Capitol Beach. Somebody thought it was probably the Platte River, but it is not. It is Capitol Beach Lake, and we're looking over the Jackrabbit. So we're looking sort of off towards the northwest in this picture, more or less. And it's labeled on one of the early maps of Capitol Beach, which was then known as Burlington Beach. It's known as a balloon field, and there was a balloon ascension field out here. So the first couple pictures are not airfields as we think of them, where we would have an airplane. They will be balloon ascension fields. Have no pictures of a balloon taking off out here. We have other places that supposedly balloons took off. 1890s certainly. Cushman Park, which was directly west of Lincoln, off of A Street, had a balloon ascension field, but we have no photographs of it. There are no newspaper recordings of it, and yet they say it was used as a balloon ascension field. Now we'll see if we figured out how to, yep. This field we have a picture of, which nobody will recognize, with the possible exception of Ed. This is Landis Field. Landis Field is approximately where the city mission is today, off of O Street, north of O. Maybe 5th, 6th, 7th, somewhere in there. And it was a baseball field, but it also was a balloon ascension field. And we do have actual newspaper recordings of it going on there, again in the 1890 to 1905 era most generally, Landis Field. The next one is our first photograph of a balloon ascension in the field in Lincoln, and this is noted on the back, which is always a danger in photographs, as being at Lincoln Park. So we'll assume that it is, and yet the picture leads me to believe it can't be Lincoln Park because there are too many trees and not enough open space. And Lincoln Park would be today where we have Cooper Park. So my doubt is, even though the picture is labeled Balloon Ascension at Lincoln Park, and I think it is dated specifically 1909, I have my doubts about it. But here endeth our balloon ascensions. We won't have to worry about them anymore anyway. Quite a few pictures were taken, and quite a few airplanes came to the state fairgrounds. And although there is one report in a book, not in a newspaper article, that there was an airplane landed on the old Lincoln Country Club grounds, which were down at about 7th and A in that general area a little bit south of there. There's really nothing to prove that ever took place, but they said they used one of the fairways at the old Lincoln Country Club to land a plane in 1909, 1910. I kind of doubt that one too, but since it's written down, we'll at least cover it. In 1910, the Nebraska State Fair decided that they would pull a coup. They would have the first airplane demonstration in the state of Nebraska and charge admission at the state fair in 1910. They then set out to do what must have been an amazing feat. They actually raised $10,000 to hire the Wright Aeroplane, A-E-R-O-P-L-A-N-E company to come and give some demonstrations. Unfortunately, that let the news slip out, and those rascals in Omaha heard about it. And so in July 23rd, coming pretty close to the first weekend in September, always the state fair at that time, they hired Glenn Curtis, a name which aviation people will recognize immediately, to come July 23rd and give a demonstration at the Midwest Aviation Conference that they held there. They used a field, and when they say field, they meant a plowed field, at Military Avenue and Fontenelle Boulevard in Omaha for an actual Glenn Curtis demonstration of a plane. We actually don't know where this is taken, but it is also labeled a state fair, so we'll just make that assumption. But they paid an amazing amount of money, the State Fair Board did, $10,000 in 1910 to bring the Wright brothers for 1 week. It was a little bit better deal than maybe it sounds initially, because they were going to come and put on 2 demonstration flights in the morning and 2 demonstration flights in the afternoon for a solid week. And I tried to figure out what $10,000 would be in today's money. And it's virtually impossible. You can go on Google and you can figure out all sorts of different ways to calculate it. Nearest I can come up with in today's money, it would be around $300,000 to $500,000. And it seems to me like $10,000 then would have been more money than the State Fair Board would have had to play with, but nonetheless, they paid the Wright brothers $10,000. They came, and they did put on a couple of, here's a postcard of the Wright brothers aviation at the State Fair, of course a biplane. They lasted only a couple days and then they wrecked the plane, so they were unable to complete the week. And I'd also like to know whether the State Fair Board recouped $5,000 of that or not, but I can't find any evidence of it. They said in their announcement they're going to use the center of the racetrack for a airfield. And I presume that's where the word airfield came from. It was just literally a field. And when we look at the airfield that was used in Omaha on Military Avenue and Fontenelle, it literally couldn't have been more than just a plowed field. There just wasn't anything on the maps to indicate it was anything more than farm ground. So they crashed, unable to complete the tenure, but they did actually fly here. And this is another photograph, supposedly of 1910, and I stuck it in because it also shows the edge of the fairgrounds racetrack. But again, these pictures which are labeled the hills and the trees, again, to me, don't look like the fairgrounds, and so we'll just have to assume that they weren't lying to me, but maybe they were. We just don't know. 1910 is also when they claimed to have used the Lincoln Country Club's fairways, but I'm going to doubt that one. Here's one of Ed's pictures, I think. This next airfield gets to be really problematic in what we're going to call it. Let's call it Woods Field for the time being. It is often called Page Field, sometimes called the South Field, all interchangeably in the newspapers, who should be fairly careful about this, but apparently are not. So we're looking in an aerial view over Woods Crest. We're looking towards the west in this picture. the field, which ran parallel to 20th Street, if we think of it as running from Calvert to High, we're in pretty good shape. It was one runway, plowed, but then grassed over. We have quite a few pictures taken there. Some of them we can actually tell from the pictures where they were taken. There is a plaque just on the west side of 20th Street right there, which says this is where the field was that Lindbergh, who came in April of 1922, used, and we have to assume it's pretty close. We do know, and I talked to Page Woods Sr., I think he was on his 93rd birthday, something like that, and he said that they parked the cars about where Irvingdale swimming pool is today, and then people walked across and used the field, which was one runway which was strictly north and south. And one of the things I noticed through the years, people said Lindbergh slept here. He seemed to have slept practically every other place in the city of Lincoln along O Street, and out even several places out along here on Van Dorn. And at first I thought, not possible, but then I guess it is possible. He could have spent the night in somebody's house along Van Dorn out there, flying from that field. This is a close-up of the plaque, and I would point out at this point that the slides have been put together by Gordon Schultz for me. So we have to thank him for getting this together, very much so. This is a plane which is labeled as being at Woods Field, a biplane. Maybe the most interesting thing that happened at Woods Field, at least from my point of view, well, there were a couple, but one of the most interesting things was on January the 20th of 1921, it was announced that for the first time in U.S. history, the electoral votes from Nebraska would be delivered to Washington, D.C., not just by air, but by a woman who would fly them there. She would actually be a passenger, not the pilot. But she, it said in the newspaper article, would leave from the aviation field south of Lincoln. That's the only clue we have there. So the 20th, she took off and got as far as Des Moines. And there she got weathered in. And the votes had to be taken from the airplane, put on a train, and taken to Washington, D.C. So we didn't get the job done, but at least they took off from Lincoln and got a good start towards there. What else happened? Okay, April of 1922, Charles Lindbergh arrived in Lincoln, learned to fly, and this is the field he would have used. Despite something we'll see about a quote of him at another field, I don't think the dates line up. I don't think he could have. So I think this is probably the field he used. The field stood and was used from approximately 1920. It's a little bit iffy whether 1919, 1920, but 1920 we'll say. It only was used until 1925 for the best part of that time. Because in 1922, a house was built on Woods Crest at 2433 Woods Crest on the south side of the street, belonging to a man by the name of Mr. Everett. And in 1925, that 1922 house was crashed into by an airplane, obviously coming from a Woods Field. At the time they built that house, there were only 2 houses in the general area, they said, and the other thing that was in the area was the airport. That was just about it. So nonetheless, what they did was they immediately took the house and added supports, making it plane-proof. And that is the house, I think, that later Bus Whitehead lived in, if you're trying to locate which one it is. This picture, we're pretty sure, is, in fact, taken at Woods Field. And it is probably, we're pretty sure also, again here, that it is the first airmail into the city of Lincoln. And here, the newspaper said it's at the South Field, which we're still pretty sure is this field. An aerial view, which is thrown in just simply because I like it. It's taken of the Capitol building, and just kind of an interesting view. has nothing to do with airfields whatsoever. Another picture pretty obviously taken from the south field, because if we look carefully at the horizon on the right side, we can see St. Thomas Orphanage, which is later going to become Bishop Heights in that area. So pretty sure this one is maybe the first picture I have, which is probably certainly correctly identified. Another of my favorite pictures is this one, which is an aerial view of a cemetery. Seems a little bit out of place, I realize. And I think the slide is a little bit out of sequence too here. Let's see. This is the south field. This is the second south field. And we'll scurry around here and figure out where we are. Notes are useless when I don't agree with myself here. At any rate, about 1925, the Lincoln Memorial Cemetery Association is incorporated. And at that time, this is going to be an airfield. This is the south field. It's 14th Street, running left and right in the picture. And this will be Lincoln Memorial Cemetery today. This is taken, obviously, sometime between or after the time the airfield is operative in there, because see the banjo sort of guitar-shaped area, that's still extant within the Lincoln Memorial Park and very obvious from aerial views today. So they will overlap each other just a little bit. This is the south field. This is the only photograph I could find of Aero Airport. That was absolutely, I was pretty sure was Aero Airport. Aero Airport started in 1920, approximately again. It's noted at that time as being on North 48th Street, but sometimes the address is listed as 48th and University Place. Now, that is really confusing because U Street was originally known as University Place within the campus, and then we have the city of University Place coming along, and what this has to do with North 48th is very, very peculiar. But at any rate, it had many different addresses. It was on North 48th Street. The buildings we see here pictured are noted on the back as being on the east side of the field. Probably Aero Airport or airfield was named for Aero Aircraft, which was located in Havelock. The aircraft manufacturer in Havelock had a manager by the name of F. Pace Woods. F. Pace Woods was also the secretary-treasurer of the aircraft company, which manufactured airplanes. We're not going to get into that today. Obviously, time is not going to do it. But the airfield, he called it Woodsport, one word, Woodsport, Woodsport Aero Field. Again, it was a field, pretty much just native sod, is what the newspaper called it. 160 acres of native sod. There was one airport, which it calls probably the one right there, 100 by 100 feet. I don't know, maybe a little overly estimated, which had room for 30 planes, and it cost them $20,000 to build. So not just a small one. Then in 1930, there was a newspaper article which said that Bill Kite, a name which will come up again in just a minute, Bill Kite stored his Aero Sport, that was an airplane manufactured in Havelock, and a Swallow biplane at Seidel's Airway. We'll talk about Seidel's Airway in a minute. Seidel's Airway was at Union Airport, but he also housed here an Aero trainer at the Aero Airport. You begin to see a little bit of the confusion that reigns in here. By 1945, they advertised having 2 sand and sod runways. Exactly what a sand runway is, I have no idea. 2 runways. One north-south runway was 2,500 feet, and one east-west was 2,000 feet. So an X, pretty much. 1946, Bill Kite incorporated something called Aero Aviation. When we think of the word aviation now, we're going to be thinking of like United Aviation, more like a service for flying people. the way he intended it. And the address he used, this makes sense, 5401 North 48th Street. His incorporation papers make sense. And it also noted that Bill Kite was the owner and operator of the Aero Airport in Lincoln. Then they stated, the newspaper, which never lies to us, right, that it was the only airfield in the state of Nebraska which had engine test facilities, a paint shop, and hard-surfaced runways. Now, it's hard to tell what they meant by hard-surfaced. In 1946, another thing happened at the Aero Airport was they had leased out the cafe at the airport, and they were fined $100 for having slot machines. So we know they were there. Then in 1950, comes into, times that I can kind of remember a little bit, they created a lake to the north of the airport. Now, I have a feeling this lake was probably already there between the airport and Salt Creek. And they built some duck blinds in it, and that's the reason it made the newspaper. Later on, when I was a kid, we called it Roper's Lake, and after that, we called it Reller's Lake. That's because of the ownership change. Probably Roper's leased the land, and it was the Roper family that had the mortuary, and they started in University Place, not in the city of Lincoln. Reller's Lake refers to the owner, I think at that time, Merrill Reller, who was an attorney. And these lakes became fishing lakes, and then in the wintertime they would build duck blinds out there and use them for that as well. 1956, a dump was established to the north of the airport, under great opposition by many people in Lincoln. And I read the people that appeared in opposition of starting the dump, and immediately jumped out at me was Johnny Johnson's name. He was a great hunter. But a lot of the people who came in opposition were high rollers, bankers, and important people in Lincoln who were obviously hunters using the lake. Obviously, it didn't make a bit of difference to the city. They had established the dump, and they were, by golly, going to use it. Aero Airport closed in 1964. Union Airport, which we'll talk about in a minute, closed in 1964, and we'll see in a minute it opens and it closes and it opens and it closes. And in 64, with Union's closure, they expanded Aero Airport just a little bit. 1971, Mr. Kite added Aero Stables, which was obviously a very lucrative business for him out there, as well as his aerial spraying service. So he was making money on the side for sure. Then in 1975, the next thing we see in newspapers is that the airport is owned by Bill Kite's estate. So we know he must have died. Now, Bill Kite, I'm old enough to remember, and maybe one or two of you are, on, I believe it's 20th Street, there was a huge billboard that said, Bill Kite's Keep You Neat Cleaners. And it was located just south of about a half a block on the west side of 20th Street. There were several cleaners in the area, Bingham Cleaners within a block there as well. And dry cleaners particularly like to be located right there around 20th and O Street, because on the northeast corner of that intersection was a fire department. And they used some very flammable materials. And I suspicion that probably they located there for a secondary reason. But Bill Kite, his sign had Bill Kite, and then he had a kite tail coming off of it. And he also was associated very much, even in the 50s, with his airport. Well, in 1975, because the city is operating the dump, and at that point in time, the people in Lincoln, who had private planes, decided that they should move the airport, and they started a drive to build a new private small airport at Waverly. It never took hold, as near as I can tell. Nothing really ever came of it. They talked about it, but then in 1975, the city of Lincoln purchases Aero Airport. But they then lease it back as an airport. Then in 1977, this becomes a point where what I'm going to tell you, you're going to say that doesn't sound like a possibility, but it actually was in the newspaper from several different directions, including from the Lincoln Park Department. So I think it is probably true. 1977, the Lincoln Park Department proposed putting a ski slope in the area, and they were going to call it, believe it or not, Mount Trashmore. So that never came about, and you can see where they're going with it. 1981, a landfill was approved by the city council, and that pretty much is the end of it, except that by 1986, if we look in the FAA reports, the Aero Airport is still listed as a, quote, landing strip. And what I think that probably means was if you had an emergency landing, you could have used it. So 1986, but obviously by then nobody was using it for sure. An artist's view. Ed loves artist's views. This is now Seidel's Field, which I had really never heard the name used before, but this is owned by the Seidel's Flying School. And this is an architect's viewing of the airport they're going to build for them. The Seidel's Flying School was on the 3rd floor of the Buick building. And the Buick building not only still stands, but is being renovated right now. They're doing a great job of it. It's on the southwest corner of 13th and Q. And it is a company which works with insurance and hospitals and so forth. I can't think of the name of the company, but they are spending a fortune in redoing the building, and it's going to be quite something when they're done with it. They've already been good stewards of the building. At that point in time, the Seidels called it Lincoln Aircraft Field, and they noted that they were using Lincoln Aircraft Field, a new name out of the blue, 4 miles south of Lincoln on 14th Street. We know where that was. That's the Lincoln Memorial Park Field. Never anyplace else is it called Lincoln Aircraft Field except by the Seidels. And they had hangars there, they claimed, for 6 planes. Then, in an article on the same week within the Lincoln newspaper, Seidel's Airways, which was like United Airlines, it was a service which transported people, said they used the field at Havelock. Now that would have to be Union Field, but they're very, very unclear. And if you look in city directories and places like that, no addresses will appear at all. So you're at your guess, your own best guess. One of the early pictures we have here, which clearly, it's not a very good picture. Gordon did the best he could from what I gave him, but you can read the word Seidel's on the side of the building, Seidel's Airway. The building and the airport there were developed not by Seidel's, but a man by the name of E.J. Sias, S-I-A-S, who addressed, interestingly enough, on the 7th floor of the Stewart building, which had then been built at 13th and P Streets. By 1930, Seidel's Airways was presided over by Harry Seidels, and the secretary-treasurer was, interestingly enough, Charles Stewart. And the Stewarts and the Seidels will have a great relationship together, particularly when we look back at the Buick Company, which is an entirely separate question. But in 1930, the Able Construction Company announced that they were going to asphalt 2 runways for the Seidels. They don't specify where it is, but it is obviously going to be Union Airport. 1933, another newspaper article, and we have to believe everything that the newspaper says. They never lie. They said that Union Airport in Lincoln, Nebraska is, quote, Nebraska's largest airport, end of quote. Now, what does that mean? I don't know, but it's a nice quote. It also goes on to say they have 2 asphalted runways, 1,820 feet running northwest and southeast, and 1,650 feet running north-south. And at this point, it is still noted as being managed by Harry Seidels. So we're pretty sure we're all in the same place at this point in time. 1940, the Sias Flying School, which is part of another program, which is on 24th and O Street, now Vintage Village Antiques building, they moved to Lakeland, Florida. And at that point, Mr. Sias, E.J. Sias, who has a very interesting background story, purchases Union Airport from Harry Seidels. Mr. Sias was a graduate of Nebraska Christian University as it became what we call today Cotner College or Cotner University for a while. He was a minister. And one of his churches in Nebraska was the one on South Street at about, what would it be, 24th and South on the north side of the street right there. It's still very much in business. So E.J. Sias, very interesting guy. And kind of a map that Gordon found someplace indicating where the airfield was, Union Airport. And in this picture, it's shown as abandoned, but he found this picture somewhere and thought we ought to include it for sure. 1946, one of the interesting things that happened out there was the Goodyear blimp had landed there, probably when it was here for something else, but they tethered it overnight there, at least 1946. Then the following year, in 1947, let's see, another picture of the runway, which we can see here. Now we have two different sets of runways, and it corresponds to the map which Gordon had in there, and it becomes very confusing at some point in here, but they're going to straighten all that out, because in 1947, they're going to announce that they put up a big beacon out there, and in a minute we'll see that. Here is a later picture still. Probably this would be Miami 1918, roughly, we'll say World War I time. This building is still there. We'll see it in a minute, owned by, or at least occupied by the Sampson Construction Company. And you can see this building very clearly in it. It's a rather nice looking building. It's now just used for storage, but nonetheless it is extant. So we'll call it still there. Now this one shows that building and another hangar overlooking the field here. This was at a point in time where the flying farmers are going to come to Lincoln and landing. I think the next picture shows where the flying farmers have landed and are all over the place there. This is 1946. But in 1947, the beacon, which is there, they also add underneath the beacon, and I think we'll see in a picture of it in a minute, a miniature golf course. And the miniature golf course was in the shape of the state of Nebraska, and it was east of the buildings which we saw pictured here. 1952, Union Airport was leased to the Lincoln Airport for use as a municipal airfield. It became the Lincoln Airport in 1952 because the Lincoln Air Force Base displaced all private planes and all commercial planes. So at that point in time, what we think of as Union Airport became the Lincoln Municipal Airport. 1956, it's noted that they did have the 55-foot tall beacon and that there were 4 unpaved runways as well as the paved ones. 1964, in May, was the last year it was used as an airfield, and it became Sias, and Mr. Sias again, Industrial Park, which it is today. 160 acres of the ground was then sold to the Burlington Railroad, 140 acres, I'm sorry. So not all of it remains in the industrial park today. Part of it the Burlington owns. Then, with the closing of the Air Force Base, from the federal government's point of view, Lincoln Airport will move back to what we call the airport. This is a rather late picture, 2020 supposedly, and we can see the brick air building. We're looking towards the west. The street up at the top would be 56th Street. The left building is also another extant hangar building. And as far as we're able to tell by going out there and driving around, you would think they would have left the paved streets and used them in the industrial tract, but apparently they're gone because all of the streets out there are very, very north-south, east-west oriented. Another picture, this I think is 2020, and it shows again the brick building on the left, still very identifiable as that really interesting brick airfield. There's the airport beacon, which still stands. The land underneath it is no longer a golf course. It is strictly storage. Not much left of it. The beacon is not operative, of course, at this point in time. Gordon threw this one in because it shows you a couple of things which you can identify quite easily. Union Airport and airport are identified in Highway 77. 56th Street is very clearly noted there. The other thing that you might be interested in is you go out that area and you find the Sias Industrial Tract. You can find the beacon without any problem, and the two hangars are there. The airport sort of peters out on the north end. It becomes trees and grass. And that area was never actually part of the airfield. It was the Havelock dump. So it at some point will be developed as something, I don't know what, but I bet you that it'll be part of the industrial tract ultimately. This is another picture dropped in by Gordon. This is Aero Airport, which should have actually been back with Aero. Unless let's see where we're going here. This shows a photograph which I took out of a book, which shows Aero aircraft ready to be flown, it says. And this is when what had been original the Hebb Brothers truck plant then became the Woods Brothers truck plant, which became the Woods Brothers aircraft plant, which became Goodyear. This is the Goodyear building. And when the building was owned by the Woods, they manufactured airplanes in there, and they, like the Ford automobile plant in Omaha, which I think is 4 stories, 5 stories tall, that I can't remember for sure, several stories tall. As the cars went through the manufacturing process, they ended up being done on the top floor. And the same thing was true of the airplanes here. There's got to be a reason, and I don't pretend to understand what it is, but the airplanes were finished and they were on the upper floor. Then they were lowered down. On the right-hand side, you can see sort of a plywood plank. They were lowered down by ropes until they could be grounded and flown away. 1920 is when the Woods Brothers bought the Hebb plant. And in 26, they started building the Aero Sport, which you will recognize as being that airplane, which used to hang in the municipal airport and may or may not reappear when they get done with the remodeling. I'm not sure. A couple of very interesting things. During the period of 1928 to 1929, best of times, the worst of times, the Woods Brothers, and this is something which I found from a number of different places coming in, so it's not one potential area, it's a lot of different people reporting the same thing from national as well as local stories. The Woods Brothers, by early 1929, were in Havelock building 4 airplanes per day. Now that's a good number of airplanes to be finishing. Some of them were stored in the fairgrounds. We have pictures of the Ag building with Aero airplanes in it. What they were doing there, I can't exactly figure out how they got them there or why they were there, but anyway, there they are very clearly. But the interesting part of the story is that in 1929, 4 airplanes a day. Here comes a quote. The Woods Brothers aircraft was now here's where the quote starts, largest aircraft production facility in the world. The largest aircraft manufacturer in the world was in Havelock, Nebraska. Now, how could that possibly be the case? Well, it's a lot like television manufacturing. Back in the 50s, there were hundreds of television manufacturers. My father had a Satchel Carlson, for example, TV set. But all these TVs were produced in very small factories in very small numbers. And that's what aircraft production was in the 1920s. Very small producers. Lots of things are just about to happen. In 1929, though, first of all, the Great Depression is going to come along. And also consolidation with the Depression is going to come along as well. We don't know exactly, but we found a newspaper article which says that the aircraft, after they were lowered down from the top, all of the land to the west and to the south of what we now know as Goodyear was a large open field. There was later a picnic grounds in there. They had a little lake in there and so forth. They used that as an airfield. and they would basically fly the planes from there to Union Airport, where they were sold and taken to wherever they went. They could be put on train cars or whatever, but basically they were flown out of there. So they closed the plant with the Great Depression in 1929 because the Woods brothers were pretty sharp. You don't find them losing money on much of anything. And in 1929, as the Depression really gets underway, they have orders on hand for 271 aircraft. But they're smart enough to know with the Depression, they're not going to be able to sell them. So they literally stop production of aircraft. And so for a short period of time, instead of building 4 per day, they're going to build 1 aircraft per month. And then in order to keep their employees working, they start a welding school within the building. And had an uncle who worked there briefly at the welding school. So the Woods brothers were taking care of their people as well at that point in time. The Depression wins its way on, and I see another slide in here that Gordon's dropped in. Oh, no, this is one of mine. This makes it a little bit clearer to understand because we're in an airplane, that's a strut, and the wing we can see at the top of the picture. We are flying along 48th Street. We are looking to the northeast in this picture. The top arrow shows Goodyear plant. And then we can see the railroad, the Burlington Railroad. I should have brought my pointer here. I don't know any way other than to step over and talk about it. But this is the Burlington Railroad. This is 48th Street right here. This is probably going to really destroy the recording, I'm sure. Right here, this pond is a pond for the Good Ice House. Right here, 48th Street. And when I was a kid, that's where we used to go if you wanted to buy a big case of ice for a picnic or something. You go to Good's Ice House. This was the pond where they froze over the winter to manufacture. They'd cut ice off of there. Good, we all know Mr. Good, don't we? Or we at least know Mr. Good's daughter. Her name was Mignonette. She changed it to Minion Good. Then she married a guy by the name of Eberhard. Minion Good Eberhard. And at the time, she was one of the most popular mystery writers in the world. Her stories didn't stand the test of time as well as Agatha Christie's, but she was very popular for a time. Her father. Okay, what else can we see here? 48th Street. This is Highway 6. Here comes the Rock Island Railroad, and headed then directly towards the east outside of Lincoln. And here's where they run into trouble, and pretty soon they're going to have to start buying lots because they don't have any land they can pick up in bulk. So here is Tuzla Avenue, and all this area in here becomes a potential airfield where they can fly those planes from. And what I think that's what was happening, because the newspaper indicates they're lowered down up here, and then they could be put on the siding. There was no siding on the Burlington as far as they could be put on the siding for the Rock Island and then could be transported out. And you can clearly see up at the top the Burlington shops. See if there's anything I've forgotten there. 1939, the Woods brothers would still probably have been okay on the aircraft field because at this time we had Wichita developing quite rapidly as an aircraft center, but also out in Seattle we had another one coming along, which you may have heard of, called Boeing. Boeing, which is later going to spin off something called United Airlines. But Boeing at that time contracted with the Woods brothers to build certain parts for airplanes because Boeing is now bringing together a lot of these little companies to make a super company out of it. They contracted with the Woods brothers to build something, and I don't know what, that they were going to buy and ship to Seattle. The Woods brothers then went east and borrowed money to retool for this order from Boeing. They got the money. How far they got with it, I don't know. But Boeing reneged on the contract and said it didn't appear to them that it would be worthwhile for them to have to take the materials that they produce in Lincoln, Nebraska, and move them by rail. But it would be much easier for them to build them in Seattle or closer to home. So The Woods brothers sold the aircraft plant March 24th, 1940, at a sheriff's sale on the steps of the courthouse at a sheriff's auction. And in 1940, the Goodyear Rubber Company moved in and became the Goodyear plant. So we've got a little bit ahead of ourselves here in the slides, but now this is Aero Aircraft. Again, we're talking about Aero Airport, slightly out of date. It's 1 mile north from University Place, which makes good sense. Okay, now to something a little bit more memorable, or that we might remember better. This is probably the first Lincoln Municipal Airport building of any consequence. In 1921, the Nebraska legislature authorized municipal governments within Nebraska to form airports. And in 1927, the Lincoln Chamber of Commerce got together with the American Legion Club, who was very interested in supporting the city of Lincoln, to develop an airfield for the city of Lincoln to be owned by the city of Lincoln. They looked at 4 different sites around the city and ultimately chose 160 acres of land, what they called north of Capitol Beach. And they paid $36,000 for that 160 acres. They then bought 30 white boundary lights and a windsock. That was their expenditures for the year. 1928, the first commercial flight to land in Lincoln was the Boeing Air Transport Company, and we know it today as United Airlines, 1928. Then the city of Lincoln approved a $100,000 bond issue to asphalt the runways out there and to buy a house which would become the first airport, what we call a terminal, if you will. And I have no pictures of it. I don't know, they authorized the money, but whether they actually bought a house and moved it in, never really totally clear. That was 1928. 1928 was also when Seidel's Airways, that's the airline company that transported passengers, was established at Union Field on what they called at that time 360 acres of land. 1929, July, they asphalted 2 runways, both 135 feet wide, of gravel and asphalt. They also built a 180 by 180 hangar and 2 smaller hangars. And they also purchased 8 green lights and 3 red lights to put at the end of the runways. And they purchased a 34-inch lens 1,000 watt beacon, 1929. June of 1930, they opened the Lincoln Municipal Airport, and its name was Lindbergh Field. Lindbergh Field. It lasted a few months with that name. I'm not sure exactly how long, but only a few months, because the FAA noticed that there was already a Lindbergh Field in the United States, and it was in California. And the FAA does not smile on having 2 airports by the same name. So someplace between 1929 and 1930, the name changed from Lindbergh Field to the Lincoln Municipal Airport. In 1930, there was a report issued by the FAA which said Nebraska has 14 airports and 10 airfields, just for your notice. 1942 in October, the U.S. Army Airfield came in. They spent $20 million, and they ended up with about 2,740 acres of land on and around an Air Force base. 1945, they inactivated that in 1945, and they closed operations in 1948, so it became just Lincoln Municipal Airport all in total again. 1952, the Korean War reactivates Lincoln Air Force Base, at which time, as we mentioned earlier, the city took a 25-year lease, which it didn't have to use all of, for Union Airport to become the Lincoln Municipal Airport, which they leased for a while from the Siases. 1959, for the first time, we have a 5-member airport authority which is established, and it becomes a taxable authority, something which they have not used unless they're just either now using it or just getting ready to use it or just considering using it. Never have used that tax base or authority to issue taxes. 1964, Lincoln Air Force Base completely inactivated, and the land was ultimately given to the city of Lincoln by the federal government. And in May of 1964, officially, Union Airport closed. We've kind of covered that with Union Airport. Today, this was the plane as it was hanging, the Woods plant hanging from, I don't know what they did with it, by the way. That was produced in Havelock, and it was hanging from the top of the old terminal. It's gone now, I can tell you that. So we have an airplane built in Lincoln, and we also have a steam engine built in Lincoln that were on display. This is, again, artist's concept of the new Lincoln Airport. By this time, we have roughly 5,000 acres of land in the airport. There are 3 runways. The largest is almost 13,000 feet, 200 feet wide, and it was for a time a space shuttle contingent field that they never used. But it was used for a while, fairly frequent out of Kansas City for training pilots. They would shoot landings and touchdowns and so forth. So long enough. At one time, I made a list. I don't know whether it's even complete, but at one time, the Lincoln Municipal Airport had the following airlines operating from it. United Airlines, of course, Frontier Airlines, America West, TWA, Midway Airlines, my favorite, Air Wisconsin, Continental Airlines, Northwest Airlines, Allegiant Airlines, Delta Airlines, and Red something, I can't remember the last part of the name, Red something, which lasted about 3 months. And today, of course, we have only United Airlines operating out of the field. An aerial view showing the lake and so forth, Capitol Beach Lake, and the huge airport, which is now Lincoln Municipal Airport, and that long, long airfield. At one time, I think it was like the 7th longest airfield in the United States. I have no idea whether that's still true or not. And I found a picture, purportedly, when this plane landed. Whoops, what happened here? Wrong button. There we go. It is noted on the photograph as being Air Force One, but of course it isn't, because it is Air Force One officially only when the president is on board. So all the airplane landed here for whatever reason, and they took a picture of it. The president wasn't on board, so it was not actually Air Force One. Now we have only United Airlines, and we have, instead of the 4 gates, we now have 6. The only thing left to do, I think, is to build a couple more over gates, and maybe we can attract another airline. I'm not sure. I think we'll take one more airfield. We're getting to the point now where I find it very interesting, and we're just about out of time. So this is my favorite airport because this is where I grew up. On the left-hand side of the picture, we have O Street, and the top of the picture is West. So don't get yourselves confused. 66th Street is on the bottom. The airfield, which we can see, is right here up the top, running pretty much left and right. This is a pond, which was manufactured, and it's on the edge of Dead Man's Run. This is the building we want to talk about right here. This is Harold Conant's laboratory, Harold Conant's original house. And he's going to ultimately own all the land with this exception of this corner right here, which is a private dwelling. He'll sell this house to his father-in-law, and he will operate this house as his house and laboratory. Because in 1931, Harold H.B. Conant developed something called the selenium rectifier, which converted AC to DC, which sounds like no big deal today. But it was the beginning of what we think of as the transistor age. And in the late 1930s, he bought about 60 acres of land, everything except that corner right there, on the northwest corner of 66th and O Streets. He later will build the house up at the top there, 6500 O Street, and laboratory buildings around it, which were connected by tunnels. And as a kid, his son was exactly the same age I am, and believe me, we loved to play in those tunnels. It was a great, great place. Another view of his airfield. Now we're looking almost directly. The top of the picture is north, And we can see several things here. We can see his landing strip, the lake which he built, his house, and right here we can see one of his tea hangars. This house is connected by tunnels at that point in time. Anything else we can see here? Not much else in there. The lake never held water. He tried everything he could think of to keep it filled with water, but it just never really did hold water and was never effective. 1970s, he sold his property, and we think of it today as being part of Gateway, but it isn't. Gateway owns around it, but that's a separate corporation that owns where Montgomery Ward's old building is, and Chuck E. Cheese's and all that. That's Conat property. I'm getting hassled. We're getting very close here. So what we might do is we might close here. We have one more thing, which actually we might be able to cover at the start of next time's program, months from today, which is Eden Sky Ranch, and one other airfield which still stands in Lincoln. But I think we'll stop here, pick it up there, and see if our